Andrew.
Hi
Vicki,
there.
Vicki and I are so excited to talk to you. We love your latest book, Mr. Whisper, as well as so many of your previous ones. So we are just delighted to have the chance. Just talking to authors is so much fun. Um, but first of
Yes.
all, we're hoping that you give us a little bit of your background because your bio is so interesting, from being an illusionist to swimming with great white sharks, um, and being a science communicator for OpenAI. Just
Yeah.
such an interesting bio. Tell us how you did all that and became an author.
Um, One, I haven't made up my mind what I'm going to do when I grow up. And so I think like a lot of us in the creative spaces, we find ourselves kind of exploring different things. So when I was younger, when I was a kid, I either wanted to be a scientist or a magician. And
Hmm.
then my dad worked for the federal government. He was an ATF agent, and we moved down to South Florida in the middle of the drug wars.
Hmm.
Lucky him. And
Right.
I met magicians who were involved working in the cruise ships and traveling around the world because it was a lot of them were kind of home based there, and sort of that piqued my interest. So kind of by my senior year of high school. I thought I wanted to go to MIT and study physics or robotics or something, but the idea of just performing magic and lounging around on a cruise ship or resort sounded kind of fun. And
Mm.
so I said my senior year, like, I think I'll do this for a couple of years, maybe give that a shot. So I built a magic show, traveled with it, toured with it. I also got into creating magic for other people. I worked behind the scenes for other magicians. I worked on a David Copperfield special. I helped create magic for Penn and Teller, worked creatively for other people, and kind of would either perform or do creative work. And then kind of reached the end of that when I was about 22 and decided that I wanted to do something different. My love of science was still there. And a mentor of mine, James Randi, had the $1 million challenge for anybody who could prove psychic powers. He'd heard about a project. He'd been a friend of my father's, friend of my family for years. He'd heard about a project I had where I was in high schools teaching critical thinking, and he wanted to know if we could make that part of what his program was doing and also have me administrate the $1 million challenge, which meant, somebody said, "Oh, I have somebody in a laboratory that can read with their fingertips." Not like Braille, but like just print or whatever. How would you test this? And I would go there and say, this is how you would try to test it using kind of a blend of my love of magic and science and stuff. So I did that for several years and thought, really what I wanted to do was to teach critical thinking and beyond the classroom was try to do that in TV. And so I said, okay, TV is the goal. And trying to get a TV show on air that's an education show would be wonderful. So I got an office at Universal Studios in Florida. Back then it was dirt cheap. So I opened up an office there, told everybody I was a TV producer, and pitched everybody I could meet and ended up doing a pilot for Animal Planet about bug bites and then met with a company that was doing uh, had an MTV production deal, and they said, "We love this idea. This is great. How about doing this other thing first?" So I found myself doing a pilot for a magic prank show. Was actually great, but not the thing I set out to do. But Hollywood being Hollywood, I'm like, well, this is interesting. Maybe it'll get me to where I want to go. And I spent
Yeah.
several years creating shows under development with other projects and stuff. And long story short, eventually ended up on A&E with a TV show called Don't Trust Andrew Mayne, which was a lot of fun. It was really cool, but it was very far afield from teaching critical thinking or being involved in the
Right.
sciences.
Yeah.
And so at the end of that, I said, I pitched some stuff that was more science related, more I was just producing it. And then I just really kind of didn't have really wasn't into it. And I started getting more into code and the technology side. AI had started to develop kind of very quickly. If you were paying attention, and so I started teaching myself how to like program small models and to do kind of that, and just sort of did project after project. I wanted to do something that was sort of blended the two, so I went to Discovery Channel and I pitched them this idea of what if I used magic technology to fool a
Hmm.
great white shark? And they're like,
Hmm.
cool, how would you
Hmm.
do this? I said, I think I could build a suit to make myself invisible. And I'd been studying some stuff in AI about how vision systems work. And I saw some parallels between that and the way we understood shark vision. And so figured out what I thought was kind of a hack and did a special for Discovery Channel for Shark Week called Andrew Mayne Ghost Diver, where I swam with great white sharks in a suit to make myself invisible, as one does. Based the
Sure.
conversation of the
Mhm.
yeah they're like I said to
Yeah.
them like they're like would you do this are you dumb enough to do this and I'm like I am that dumb they're like congratulations you're on
Now,
Shark Week.
were you a diver before you
Yeah,
did that?
I'd scuba dive before. I grew up in
Yeah,
South Florida. Like if you read
right.
my Sloan with
Yeah.
Pearson books,
Yeah.
like that's,
Yeah.
so yeah, scuba dive before,
Yeah.
and then I went through and we also like trained to do like we would call it rebreather, which is a closed loop
Hmm.
system to do that, for the special. But after that, I was just really kind of just full on studying and working and developed my own projects for AI and. This was around in 2019. OpenAI announced a model called GPT-2,
Hmm.
and GPT-2 is sort of the grandfather to ChatGPT. I
Hmm.
was very excited about this because somebody who loves writing and language, it was interesting to see an AI that could start to understand it. Not,
Hmm.
not write like we can, but still understand some basics of it that people thought it couldn't do. And I said, this is a breakthrough.
Right.
And they had published
Yeah.
tons of art, simulated text that had written, and I read every single one they published. And so through that, I started to get understanding of kind of like how it worked.
Hmm.
And so I talked about it on some podcasts and said, "Yeah, this is really more interesting than people think." And then next thing you know, OpenAI reached out to me, said, "We have a thing called GPT-3. Do you want to play with this?" And so I was under NDA. I said, "Yeah, let me play with it." And I ended up writing a lot of the original prompt library for GPT-3. If you go there and you see like try this, and so
Wow.
it was neat because being a person who loved science, loved critical thinking, loved writing and talking to a language model, I was
Hmm.
able to like, be at a very cool opportunity to play with this stuff. So I spent 2 years doing what we called like those my titles creative applications. And so I
Hmm.
worked on like figuring out new things. I was the internal, you've heard of prompt engineering or
Hmm.
prompt whispering.
Hmm.
So I was the
Hmm.
first one that OpenAI ever hired explicitly sort of to do that. And so
Wow.
internally I was their prompt whisperer, but their goal was to replace that. They didn't want to make
Yeah.
these models so complicated. You had to be thinking like all about sort of language to do it.
Right.
And so 2 years into that, I was asked to be the science communicator. So then I became the science communicator for OpenAI, and I spent 2 years doing that. And then that was
And
great.
who's your audience for that? I mean, at that point, were you talking to companies or schools?
That's more like media, behind the
Hmm.
scenes, going on background for, let's say, hypothetically, New York Times, like
Yep.
whatever people they want to know. Have how I would go explain how the technology worked
Mm.
to,
Hmm.
somebody before they'd start an article. So then when they talk to the researchers and stuff, they have a good idea. I'd go to the
Right.
White House, I would explain things there. And so like
Mm.
basically it was just trying to help figure this out, but also the launch of GPT-4, I worked with Joanna Jang, who's now in charge of like the model personality stuff. We worked on
Hmm.
the GPT-4 launch, and I had to figure out how do you communicate to people what this does? How do you find
Hmm.
these examples? And so it was a mixture of how you describe it and then playing right here with trying to figure out, okay, how do I give somebody a very
Right.
clear, simple example of how this thing's smarter than other
Hmm.
models?
And
Hmm.
Andrew, was that sort of the progression then into what people, are now really understanding about the large language models? The LLM, is that,
Mm.
where writers especially are really reacting to that? Was
Yeah. Yeah.
is
I mean,
that, am
yeah.
I following? I'm not the science person. Wynne is the
No, yeah.
engineer. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what happened was early on, the models were really good at, a GPT-3, could help you fix your grammar in a paragraph or two, could help you do that.
Hmm.
And GPT-4 and ChatGPT, we went from GPT-2 to GPT-3, GPT 3.5, then ChatGPT, which was a variant of GPT 3.5, then
Hmm.
GPT-4, which became the new version of ChatGPT. And so as these models progressed, they became better. They became able to handle larger amounts of text,
Hmm.
etc.
Hmm.
But if you're a writer and you use them, yeah, they're good editors. They're good starting points for stuff. And they can actually do pretty good short stories now, I'll be honest with you, but they're
Hmm.
still not writing novels.
Right.
Yeah. Gotcha.
Right.
Wow.
I had a funny story where my
Amazing.
9-year-old was gonna write a paper because it was sort of a thank you note sort of paper right after I'd thrown her a birthday party. And so she gets into Word and she sees that the Copilot prompt is there and it
Hmm.
says, can I help you write? Do you want to draft with Copilot? And she goes, Mom, should I use this? I go, well, does Copilot know your mother?
Right?
I
Yeah.
mean, it could probably help you draft something, but
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's
it's a
that
co-pilot, not a pilot. Yeah.
exactly.
Right.
Um,
But I think it comes through so well in your characters. And I'm thinking specifically of, Mr. Whisper about kind of the cohesiveness and the cohabitation, that these things don't need to be
Hmm.
distinct. You can have a little mysticism, you can have science, you can have magic, you
Hmm.
can have all of that can kind of work together, but they don't need to be at odds.
Hmm.
And so I think, reading, and your characters, Theo Cray and Jessica Blackwood are so interesting to read
Hmm.
because they're coming from their place of, great expertise,
Hmm.
but the bantering that they do with one another and the learning that occurs, as they're
Hmm.
bouncing ideas back and forth, it's a delight to read.
Hmm.
I like to live in kind of both worlds. Like I use ChatGPT. I use these tools all day long. I code, I do this, but also I have behind me a row of books all about memory methods and memory
Hmm.
palaces. And
Hmm.
these aren't new constructions. This used to be the way that we retained
Right.
information. If you think
Yeah.
about how do we have epics like the Iliad and Homer and whatnot?
Hmm.
How did they exist before writing? It was because people were able to remember these things. And I'm a big fan of critical thinking and problem solving. So I love to spend time with these systems, but then I love to spend time not using anything at all and just
Hmm.
trying to, work on my own skills as,
Yeah.
somebody trying
Right.
to be a better critical thinker.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's the wonderful thread that ties through all of this, right? Through
Hmm.
the um being an illusionist and being a scientist, and your characters, Jessica Blackwood, who comes from that illusionist background, and Dr.
Hmm.
Theo Gray. One of the quotes that I love, and this actually comes from the Looking Glass, or Looking Glass, is Dr. Theo Gray says, "This is why I laugh at the notion of reconciling faith and science. Science
Yeah.
is based on the premise that logic and reason can tell us the true nature of reality. Religion is based on the idea that when logic and reason don't support a predetermined view of reality, they are at fault. The
Yeah.
next time you get into a political discussion, stop and ask yourself what amount of evidence would change your mind. If the answer is none, then realize it's actually a religious discussion. One more zealot arguing with another."
Yeah.
Uh, and
Wow.
that's a reflection on myself. I think about
Yeah.
like when I'm
Mhm.
argumentative or I get this
Mhm.
thing and I'm like, I know this is true. And then, you know, the times where I've been really kind of, cut to my knees has been when I talk to like a really good logical thinker, and I can think of a
Mhm.
couple who've been like, "What is your evidence for that?" And then
Mhm.
I'm like, "Well, it just feels right." And then I'm like, "Okay, I'm a person that likes logical explanations and stuff." And when I start to go into like it feels, then then my
Yeah.
opinion's no different than anybody else's.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Right.
I think
Well,
one of the things I really appreciate in, Wynne has read more of your work than I have, but I think um, the coming together for people around common concerns and issues, and I think, whether you intended it or not, I think the timeliness of Mr. Whisper speaking to younger generations in the sense of isolation and seeking out things like Chat GPT and apps and relationships and connection
mhm.
through technology is something that I think a lot of people are grappling with. My background is in the social sciences and, higher ed and as a therapist. So I think about that and um, the value in what you've written about what's really happening right now. And so how do you, when you're writing something like Mr. Whisper, how do you make sure that you're staying on top of things that are actually happening culturally? Because I felt like I was reading in real time about things that I'm aware of that folks are struggling with. And whether it's post-pandemic or it's just, the battle between in person and that sense of isolation and the threat that people feel still about technology, it felt like you were speaking about so many present day concerns.
I, certainly a lot of the things we experience now, there were versions of it before. There were things about it before. I can remember 20 years ago somebody having a conversation with me about how his neighbor doesn't interact with his family. He just spends all his time like on the internet.
Mhm.
And I can remember 20 years before somebody said about somebody all they do is watch TV. And
Yeah.
as these technologies become better at acquiring our attention and we create a more competitive marketplace for our attention, certainly they're going to just improve, their ability to like their stickiness for us. And so I would say that like with Mr. Whisper, I'm a big believer that like AI is going to be one of the most positive, beneficial things we've ever faced. And I think across the boards, I know people that have been. I had a conversation with a friend yesterday who was in a car accident, talked to
Oh,
ChatGPT after it. ChatGPT calmed him down, got to a place where he was able to relax, understood
yeah.
it, then spoke to his therapist the next day. And his
Hmm.
therapist was like, "Yeah, these are all the right steps." And so it was he used it as a compliment. It was a way to say,
Hmm.
"Okay,
Hmm.
he couldn't get the emotional reach, the connection with somebody he needed. He was able to use it, but he also understood what it was. And there's been some really
Right.
interesting data that shows that AI models can be extremely good, very patient, very helpful in the role of therapy, but
Hmm.
they're an AI model. And when you
Hmm.
understand that, when you understand what you're using, versus the challenge I go into with Mr. Whisper is that when you're talking to people who are developing, young people, 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds who haven't even learned how to have human bonds yet.
Yeah.
And just the idea that, and I don't really have a strong opinion either way, but I do think that like I think these things are going to be there, and I wanted to write it like these things are here. They're not going to go away. We have to be aware of it, and we have to
Hmm.
understand that.
Yeah.
And I kind of wanted to use that as a theme because the theme is about how easy it is to manipulate people. We know that through
Hmm.
social media, and
Hmm.
we know that AI, super AIs, will be extremely effective manipulators. And I don't think the answer is there's no way we can stop that progression. The thing that I believe is we have to make people aware, teach
Yeah.
young people to understand that, maybe
Hmm.
build technologies to act our own behalf, whatever. But it's so as a writer, it's just sort of I want to explore this because I believe in all this positive benefit. I think the answer is for people to learn to use these tools and embrace these tools so you
Hmm.
understand them. Because if you don't, then, when you get an email, a lot of it, if you use ChatGPT or use an AI, you get a spam from a ChatGPT thing. You can kind of spot it better than does somebody who doesn't use it.
Hmm.
Right. And I
Hmm.
love what you said about the complementary nature,
Hmm.
and being open to it and understanding that vulnerability won't go away, that that
Hmm.
needs to be addressed. But I think looking at AI as a tool,
Hmm.
and trusting just enough, but not making it a sole source solution.
Hmm.
And the exact example you described. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I work, I'm around the field. I still work in the field, and I'll hear like, well, when robots do everything, I'm like, they can't do everything by
Hmm.
nature because one is a human, one is a robot. And what I mean by that is that robots might be able to outpace us intellectually, physically, whatever. But because they are able to do that, that means they don't have the same vulnerabilities we have.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And that actually vulnerability is a value or a strength. You don't want to go to an AA meeting
Yeah.
with a bunch of people who've never done drugs, you
Right.
don't how or
Yeah.
alcohol or whatever, like
Right.
there's not a value to that because
Right.
there's no shared experience. And you could say, well, I could simulate it. Well, then everything is going to be acting and then nothing will ever be real. I
Hmm.
bring this up too. It's like you're not going to want to send your child to a kindergarten run completely by robots. I'm
Hmm.
probably going to want some robotic nurses, some teachers' aides, maybe robots to help the special needs kids get even more attention, things
Right.
that can really assist everybody. But
Yeah.
we want humans in all these things, but we have to think about what makes humans special. And it's not
Hmm.
Yeah.
not necessarily, oh, we're the most creative or we're the most adaptable. It is
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
we're human.
Hmm.
Yeah. But
Hmm.
I would can I order a Doug from you? Can I order a Doug
Yeah.
robot?
So
Yeah, I'd like a
so
Doug. Hmm.
so in the book I have Theo has this tool which is like this quadruped robot called Doug which talks and moves around and does stuff. And it's so funny because I write this, I'm like, man, 5 years ago this would feel like science fiction to people. This would be like
Hmm.
science fiction. But when I
Yeah.
put this into a book now, you go, yeah, I could see this, in a,
Right.
being
Yeah.
on, in a video right now, and that's sort of the funny thing is just
Yeah.
that how quickly things have moved.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
One other writing note, we were sort of talking where we are all located before we started recording, and
Hmm.
and I asked about Cap Island
Yeah.
because it reminds me, it's in the Seattle area as I am, and it reminds me of a lot of islands around here. Tell us how you came to Cap Island.
So when I when I use locations, I might take a location that's kind of like where I want, but give it a different name or something because I'm like, oh, the mayor is a serial killer. I don't want the mayor of that actual town to like have to deal
Right.
with that.
Right.
Right.
Uh, So what I do is a couple tools I use. One is I use Google Maps.
Mhm.
Remember going into Google Maps and hovering over I grew up in Portland, Oregon, by the way.
Mhm.
And so I remember, some of the islands and stuff there. And then I went and looked around the area and started looking at different islands and just sort of zooming around and thinking where would be a couple feasible locations. The goal of the book was I wanted to have a location where my characters could be cut off
Mhm.
because I realized I've got an incredibly powerful team of people. I need them put in a situation where they're not in control. And I thought about like, well, you're in, an island or something else like this. You're in a different, kind of area
Mhm.
outside of being an urban metropolis where you just call 911 necessarily. So I looked around and I saw Hat Island, and I'm like, well,
Mhm.
that's cool. I'll just change that to Cap. And I'd have to go pull it up. But one of the things I do then is I'll go do you drop the little person on the ground and you go look around, you
Mhm.
do that. But then also I'll go into VR. And I remember going into VR and picking an island in that area and looking around. And so the location and the description of everything was based upon a couple
Mhm.
of different places I was actually there. And the fun thing about using like a map, a VR, a 3D map in VR is that you don't have to. Like I've done Street View all the time. Like Street View is great. Like
Mhm.
Street View, I've written books like take place through the streets of Brazil and be like, oh, it's so accurate. I'm like, I went through several miles of Street View of just finding these things to look into it.
Hmm.
But VR is really cool because you just sort of stand there and you look around and you go like, what
Mhm.
do I notice? Oh, I noticed this over there. I noticed there's a boatyard over here, but there's a fence around it, And oh, I noticed that there's the building over here where they're selling the bait is just, really, really old and weather beaten in
Mhm.
one side because of the wind. And you're like, oh man, like it's like an actual writer would notice these things.
Right, right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
It's
Do you
writing
find
gold.
because you lived in Florida for a while, do you find that when you're looking for that location-based info to kind of get inspiration, do you find that even if you've lived in that locale, that you need to kind of cross-check yourself about memories? Like you put yourself into it just like because you might have a faulty memory, and there's so much research that goes into all of this that, especially in Mr. Whisper, you're all over the place with the characters.
Yeah,
There's a lot of traveling.
I have to. Other people, like my dad wrote a biography and I've been reading it right now. My dad has this incredible autobiographical memory. I
Mm,
have terrible memory
Mhm.
about just my own personal life and events. I'm like, yeah, that happened or whatever. And so I have to, even for places where I grew up, because
Mhm.
like I don't pay attention. I don't pay
Mhm.
attention
yeah,
nearly as well as I should. So yeah, absolutely, I'll go there, and then you'll notice like, oh, I didn't know this was next to there. I didn't know that was over there.
Mhm.
Yeah,
yeah,
so even places I'm familiar with, I have to do that.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't think a fun thing I like to do too is I've done is where I did this for uh, a book, my first novel, Public Enemy Zero, where I took an area that I knew in Fort Lauderdale and I took an area that I knew pretty well in Santa Monica, California, and I kind of blended the two. And
Mhm.
was able to write kind of a pretty descriptive scene of some detectives going door to door and whatnot. And I remember that was my first experience of like, oh, take this from here, put this there. And the funny thing was a couple years later, the apartment I'd been staying at,
Mhm.
Whitey Bulger, the
Oh,
notorious fugitive,
Yeah,
had
yeah.
been living
oh,
400 feet away. And I
what?
wrote a scene of detectives canvassing the house he would have lived in, but
Wow.
they didn't find anything.
Wow.
That's so cool.
Oh, yeah,
That's
that
so
is
cool.
cool. Oh my gosh, right? But how do you not get lost in the soup of all of that? I'm just always amazed, with people that write thrillers with a high level of detail and
Mhm.
technical threads and, a lot of action, and there's so much of that in this book. How do you avoid getting lost, in your own ideas?
Um, you know, I took I've only taken a handful of writing classes, and I took a writing class years ago. And I got really, really great advice, and the teacher, a great note, and the teacher pointed out, said, your world building was great. Your characters are the thing I want to know more about.
Mhm.
Hmm.
And then I realized that what I needed to do was sort of flip the script on that, and it was to focus on my characters first because the world building would sort itself out because I
Mhm.
knew that was going to happen. And
Hmm.
that's why most of my books up until the last two have been first person POV.
Mhm.
Hmm.
And so Mr. Whisper's not, but having spent so much time thinking first and foremost in that person's head, when I write, I tend to think with kind of like the lens of what they're looking at or what's
Mhm.
important to them. And so that helps me
Hmm.
understand. And we
Hmm.
talk about, we have different writing terms to describe that, what is.
Mm,
But for me, it was just helpful to think about, okay, Jessica, what is Jessica going to pay attention to in the scene? What is Theo? And that also helps me make the characters different because
Yeah.
for four characters, they're going to pay attention to
hmm
four different things.
hmm
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But
But it
I
gives the
love,
reader some predictability too. Sorry,
yeah,
Wynne.
that's all
Yeah.
right. I love how your personal experiences sort of inform all these four characters.
Yes.
The illusionist behind Jessica Blackwood, and the science with Dr. Theo Cray, and
Hmm.
your diving experience with Sloan McPherson, and
Yeah.
maybe more of your dad's ATF experience behind Brad Trasker. It's just
Yeah.
awesome how you've taken all those experiences and then you bring them all together in this book. Was that hard to map?
Well, like what I'll do is like for Jessica, I was a magician who grew up in a family of cops. My dad was ATF, my brother's FBI.
Mm,
My dad did Secret Service detail and Sky
mm,
Marshal stuff, and so so I just flipped that around and I'd go
mhm,
like, okay, and that would be like, what is it? If I was writing, for writing a female character, I have to go, there are a lot of things I take for granted that you can't. You
mhm,
have to think about like
Yeah.
when I talk to my female friends and stuff, what's it like for them? And they're like, well, you always feel like your opinions are being judged a little bit more harshly,
mhm,
whatever. If you insult somebody or you joke with
mhm,
somebody, if they have a fragile ego, they
Yeah.
don't take it as well from a guy. And so it's
mhm,
like, oh yeah, that's an interesting detail because it's not my role, but it's a role I'll have to think about. And so that makes,
Yeah.
and when I'm in that scene, I have to think a lot about like, what is her perspective on that? And so it's helpful to certainly use like yeah, you take a little bit of a, as a starting point everybody's different sort of experiences, but then to
mhm,
really try to understand how they're different.
mhm,
Yeah.
And the argument I kind of make is like I have to be able to if I sat them all down at a dinner table, they would not agree. They wouldn't necessarily argue, but they would have
mhm,
different takes. And if I
Yeah.
took their names off of it and I wrote their dialogue, could I tell you who said what? And
Hmm.
if
mhm,
I can't, it's not always the case, but if it's and that also helps make sure that I'm not just making them puppets for me.
mhm,
Hmm.
And they're all going to be avatars of ourselves to some extent, but different
mhm,
sort. Like I take points where I felt insecure or unheard, and I can put it in one character. I feel like
mhm,
Sloane McPherson comes from a point of view of where she feels always being judged and
mhm.
whatnot, and we all have that, and I tap into that. And
Right.
so you take where Brad Trasker is a guy that just zero F's to care about that. This guy's,
Yeah.
career counter spy, whatever kind of
Mhm,
thing. And,
Yeah.
so yeah, it is a thing where I think that, I try to take both your experience and then, as humans, we have a wealth of emotional experiences and we
mhm.
take that balance and figure it out.
Right.
Yeah. And we would never want to give too much away, but so much of that all kind of crescendos so
Mhm,
beautifully at the
mhm.
end. Yeah.
It's so
You try,
On
true.
the
yeah.
edge of my seat.
Yeah.
And I also want to say no good things ever happen on an
Yeah.
island. I'm just going to say that. I'm just going to say
Ricardo
that.
Montalban would disagree.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
We're
I
all
don't
the
know.
right age to understand that joke.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And then some. Yeah. My
So you've
gosh.
gone from an indie author to a top-selling published author. I think you have two books coming out this year. What's fuels your creative? I mean,
I mean, we all have these things where like I wonder if that
mhm,
you kind of think about what would happen if that. And
yeah.
so for me, I've got a list of things of stories I'd like to explore because I do like to go, well, what would happen if this happened? And
Right.
so and you just take your interest. It's funny because people go like, your books are so well researched and you're so smart. I'm like, literally, if you take a line of every little fact I know, I just drew a circle around, I just drew a pattern around that, and that was the book. If we went 4 degrees this way, if they walked into a mail room instead of this, computer, I would not know what to do, and you would show. Like I remember I was writing a book once. I had an idea, kind of a fun, kind of like
Yeah.
cool thriller about submarines and stuff. And I knew a little about submarines, and I was trying
Hmm.
to read some manuals on submarines. I'm like, I ain't Tom Clancy,
Yeah.
And so I'm like,
Yeah.
I know AI, I know magic, so I'll go write
Yeah.
anything about
Yeah.
AI and magic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
Did you start writing as a kid? I mean,
Yeah, but like I would write ideas. I would
yeah.
write ideas and stuff, and I could write jokes or little short paragraphs and stuff. I was not a prodigy. I was not this person writing novels at 15, 16, and I didn't write my first full-length novel till I was 37.
Mm-mm.
and I think that a lot of times, we are for anybody who's aspiring to write out there, do it. Like,
Hmm.
we will hear stories of other people's success, and their survivorship bias is a big part of it. And I would say that, for me, I hesitated to write because I thought, well, I wasn't
Hmm.
Stephen King, I wasn't this journalist that, had experience writing,
Hmm.
thousands of,
Right.
pages per, year or whatever. You kind of have to just sort of decide you want to tell a story and figure out how to do it. And so I wrote, I had ideas, I was always trying to be creative. That's why I invented magic tricks. I always did that.
Hmm.
But, my early attempts were not great.
Yeah. Say,
Yeah.
you just mentioned survivorship bias. Say more about that.
Yeah.
So, when you go to a conference, let's say a writing conference, and you get a panel of like great writers up there talking. I remember sitting in the audience and I'd see them talk about like, well, how do you do it? Like, well, write a great book, send it off to the publishers, and then rinse, repeat, and then which cool. I mean, that can work. It will work for X number of people per year, but the more
Yeah.
people trying to write and fewer publishers publishing, and
Yeah.
I had a discussion with a friend who was like who was a big fan of somebody who was giving that advice and pointed, well, here's this article. This person says this. I'm like, that article was from 2008. There was no Kindle, no Kindle Unlimited.
Hmm.
Yeah.
There were way more publishers actively looking. Publishers did not
Hmm.
ask you how many Twitter followers you had in 2008.
Hmm.
That
Right.
is, and I was trying to explain like today, because he's like, well, how do you, I know you have survivorship bias. Like, I'm like, I do, but I'll give you the facts of the landscape is that publishing deals are often made by Twitter followers.
Hmm.
And that I think that what happens is that I spent half a year in Japan performing magic, realized I was done with magic for that point in my life. I didn't want to do that anymore. I realized I didn't want to stand on stage every night at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday and say the same thing. And I took the money I had and kind of just took a year off. And I was living in Orlando at that time. I'd go to the Orlando Public Library and I'd check out every biography I could, Steve Jobs, Walt Disney, anything and everything I could.
Hmm.
And I kept trying to find myself. I kept trying to find the blueprint, kept trying to find
Hmm.
the blueprint,
Yeah.
for what do I need? Who do I need to follow?
Right.
Hmm.
And it's going to be cliched. And, a 12-year-old could tell you, guess what? It's not in there. You have to write it yourself. And that was the truth. And I think that often we look at successful writers and other people in the pattern they followed
Hmm.
and say, oh, this is the pattern I have to follow.
Hmm.
Hmm.
But it's not. And
Right.
even I've looked at other successful people and realized that like sometimes their patterns look similar and you find out they're very different. I learned this in magic because I go like, how did David Copperfield become famous versus Doug Henning versus Penn and Teller versus David Blaine? And they
Hmm.
all had these, and their paths were often dependent upon the state of the art of the time.
Hmm.
David Copperfield came up in a time when the TV special was super big, and Doug
Hmm.
Henning, uh, came out first. He did a stage show in Canada, then it made it way to Broadway back when Broadway was super experimental, and he did that, and then that got him a variety show, then that. And then you go to David Blaine in the era when people were like sensitive to the special effects and stuff. So it was, it was kind of like pre but reality TV
Hmm.
style. And you just sort of see that. And for writers, it's the same thing, is that, the next Stephen King isn't going to follow the same formula that Stephen King followed.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's
Yeah.
a good point.
Yeah,
Very
and
good
I
point.
love, and forgive me, Andrew, because I don't know when you wrote this, but you've written two books, The Cure for Writer's Block and then How to Write a Novella in 24 Hours. So given what you just said about kind of your writer's journey, where did those pieces land?
Those nonfiction pieces, because
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I decided I was 37. I decided, okay, I want to be a writer. I want to do this. I had the benefit of that time, benefit of being single, having a lot of spare time to be able to do it. I had a little business that, was able to support me modestly, but kind of keep me going. And I said, okay, I'm going to spend the next year. They talk about getting your first million words out. I'm going to try to write my million words in a year. And I said, I'm going to write 10 books. I'm going to just write book after book after book after book, lock myself up in my condo like a
yeah.
sociopath. And I would write a book I'd write a book, then
Hmm.
I'd read a book on writing. Then I'd
Mm,
write another book, then I'd read a book because you can't just do a thing without a pattern to make a path to make it better. Every
yeah.
successful
Hmm.
startup, this is from AI models, everything.
Right.
You need a feedback loop. You need something in there. And that can be,
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that sometimes people can have feedback loops, and sometimes they're like, I'm going to do an MFA program. Like that might be the worst thing possible.
Hmm.
It can
Yeah.
depend. But anyhow, I realized for me, would just read a book on writing, analyze what I wrote, and keep going back and forth on that. And so I'd say that I got very lucky in that the first novel I wrote, Public Enemy Zero, did really well. I wrote a novella before that, and I put in the Public Enemy Zero. I did it, released it myself, put it on Amazon, the Kindle,
Hmm.
the Kindle program, and was able to promote it through my podcast and stuff and get people to read it. And that got me, I was making money from Hollywood off of options before I was making book deals. And it's just how weird the
Mm.
business could be. And so
Hmm.
that just being a late starter made me very reflective on it. So I started writing, I wrote um Cure for Writer's Block. I forget which one I wrote first. That's how terrible my memory is, but Cure for Writer's Block was realizing that there's different ways that when people say they have writer's block, there's often they're describing different things sometimes.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's not that they don't have any ideas, they have a million ideas, they don't know
Hmm.
which one to choose.
Yeah.
Right.
Sometimes they just trying to figure out how to go from a blank thing. Sometimes they're trying to figure out a rubric for figuring out what is a good idea. And
Hmm.
sometimes people are trying to figure out, okay, I'm 40 pages in, but I'm stuck. And I find out like you're not stuck. You just wrote a terrible last chapter that put you in this position that you just need to throw out and start over.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that was that.
Yeah.
And then how to write novella in 24 hour novella, which I could probably update now. Now with dictation, I could probably do a novel in 24 hours. It would not be good,
Hmm.
but
But it'd be done. Yeah.
it would be done. I
Yeah.
would be able to pat
Hmm.
myself on the back and say I
Yeah.
wrote a bunch of sequential words.
Yes.
But hollow like little wins like that are good though because they do show that you can do a
Hmm.
thing. But anyhow, I
Yeah.
wrote that because once I understood, once I was starting to get, and not pushing myself like 24,000 words per day,
Yeah.
days, and I'm like, okay, why is this working for me? And why do other people struggle? And I looked at that. I said, oh, let me write about this because I think a lot of people, we talk about like, don't edit as you write. And some people, that's fine to do that. But I'm like, don't
Hmm.
edit as you write, have a plan,
Hmm.
do this. So I said, oh, let me write this because I listen to some older writers who are much better writers than me, though, will talk about like, I don't have to plan, I just do it. But I'm like, inside your head, there is a heuristic that you know. You may not be consciously aware of it,
Um,
but you know when
yep.
something's getting too long. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yep.
Hmm. But it's amazing to me that, who you are and what you bring and what you know about that balancing act between illusion and reality and how you bring that into your writing. What you bring comes from such a knowing place
Hmm.
about showing but not over showing and the withholding. And I have to believe that some part of that comes from your craft as an illusionist and a magician, that you have to be careful about what you allow people to see, what you allow readers to infer. Am I going to an odd place, or does that make sense to you?
No, it makes sense. I mean, I look at when stuff that I wrote poorly and stuff I feel okay about, and the stuff that I feel okay about were things where and it's the same like a magic show, is that I gave you enough clues to put the story together. I
Hmm.
didn't
Hmm.
tell you the story, you
Right.
put it together. And
Yeah.
it's the show, not tell, and that applies to magic. And I have a magic effect that I invented. You may have seen it where somebody walks on stage with a paper bag, they shake it upside down like a feather falls out or something like that, and then they shake it again and a bowling ball falls out, right? Um, I came up with this because I was actually trying to think of a really good demonstration for psychology students on how we have indirect evidence because I never go out there and say, hey, the bag is empty. And I never show you the inside of the bag. You just see that the bag is super light
Hmm.
because I can flip it around and a feather falls out. Um, and that kind of tells a lot to like how when I feel good about my writing is generally when I'm like, okay, I've given enough pieces along the way that the story is being assembled in the reader's head. And
Hmm.
that was the problem. Like a lot of these AI writing is you ask AI to write a short story and it just gives you a summary of a story. It tells you, blurts it out,
Right.
right?
Overtells.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Versus understanding, theory of mind is my favorite phrase of all. Like when the core of any critical thinking course is understanding theory of mind, in my opinion, and theory of mind is the understanding that other people perceive information and can do so differently than you or I do. And we have to be
Hmm.
aware of what information they have versus what you have.
Hmm.
Bad writing, bad movies, bad TV shows, you see there's a complete lack of theory of mind. There's also what I call sociopathic writing, where it's like, the good guy to get in the facility has to break the necks of five people to get in there. Like,
Yeah.
wait a
Yeah,
second, and then they
right.
save the life of the bad guy because I'm not, we don't want to be as bad as him. Like those other people were people.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
that not realizing it, but yeah, theory of mind is like a great thing. And
yeah.
I used to have to do this as a magic creator because I would say, okay, if I want to try to come up with a magic effect for Penn and Teller, they have a very different sensibility than my own. How do
Mhm.
they see a thing? And as you start to develop characters, you think of like, how do they see that? And you start to think about from the point of view of your audience. And tricky part too is that I know that when I write something that's a mystery thriller, really experienced mystery thriller things are going to pick stuff up right away.
Mhm.
Casual
Yeah,
readers won't, and that becomes
yeah.
a bit of a challenge.
Hmm.
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 Okay,
I
I
see
have to
that.
circle back to that one
Mm.
year that you were going to write 10 books in a
Yeah,
year. Did you do 10 books?
Yeah, some are novellas. So some are
Okay.
novellas.
All
So
right.
still.
But 10 in a year, that is
And I didn't really,
phenomenal.
and the plan
Yeah.
was I would write some, and then if I
Yep.
liked it, I'd put it out. But the goal was just to just get the work in and not
Right.
treat anything as precious.
Right. Right. To get the
Oh,
practice. Yeah.
ooh, that's
That's so good.
so
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah.
But also that rhythm that you described about I'm going to create it and then I'm going to go and learn a little bit more and then
Yeah.
revisit. Were you doing that while you were also moving on to like number two and number three? How are you cycling all of
I
that?
wasn't revising. I'd write it and I'd say, what should I have done differently? Then I'd go write a new book.
Mm,
Okay.
I'm kind of
Wow.
a first draft guy, by the way. Like I'm kind of
Mm,
like that's why I kind of I
mm,
plot, I outline. I'm a very big outliner, very, very
mm-hmm.
big. I try to solve for things in outlines. A pattern I've seen in this is um I I gave advice to two young filmmakers around the same time, both around the same age. One was a little younger than the other one. One came out of film school, one was, from a different background. And, they both wanted to make their first films. And the film school kid had made a lot of experience making tons of short films, stuff like this. And,
mhm,
he asked me, I didn't really have any advice for him other than I said, like, don't go into debt making your movie because you're going to want to make something else. You're going to be stuck with this movie for a couple of years. And if you go into debt, you're
mhm,
not going to do it. And I said the same thing to the other one. And I also said, you need to go make more short films because you don't know what you don't know. And he was like, no, I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm going to be doing. I understand this. I'm like,
mm,
I can tell you this. And he's like, and I appreciate the arrogance because I've had that. The
Mm.
one that had a pretty good idea, both of them their final budgets ended up being way bigger than what they were. But one of them, the budget increased because he did such a great job there. He took it to Hollywood. He had other people wanted to come in and say, hey, let's finish this up, whatever. And he just had a premiere at South by Southwest. He got a wonderful write up in Variety. This guy's trajectory is taking off. The other one, who I said you should go make some films before you go, short films before you this because he didn't have the same experience as this other filmmaker.
mhm,
His film ballooned in cost to try to get it and didn't go out to big festivals, didn't go there because the production was
mm,
such a production logistical problem. And then I don't know when he's going to be doing his next film because that was such a nightmare to get through. Where the other one is now having studios are going to want to offer to pay to do his next
Mhm.
film. And my
Mhm.
wow.
point, this point to bring up is like with writing is that like we have an idea we're in love with and we spend so much time with it, but your goal is to improve as a writer. You have to
Hmm.
get past the sunk cost fallacy. Your goal isn't the fact that you got to 100,000 words. Your goal is to say, I am now the person that got to 100,000 words. And if
Mm,
you are passionate
hmm.
about an idea and you want to keep working on it, absolutely to do that. But if you say, no, I want to be a writer, then write the next book. And the goal of all of these is to say, how quickly can you get to the next work and the next one and the next one after that? If your goal is to continue to do that. Like I said, there's different paths, but my
Mhm.
point is like, yeah, like I knew I wanted to get to the next lesson.
Mm.
But when you say you're a first draft guy, I mean, come on. So I get the plotting, but it doesn't mean that you allow it to sit and marinate and
I I
breathe and then you come back?
no, I mean, unfortunately, the way I work now is I think about it for a while, and then once I have a pretty good idea of my acts or the major conflicts and the beats, I figure out the beats. Then I sit down
Hmm.
with my note cards and my note card it out.
Mhm.
I
Hmm.
sit down with my note cards, I sit down and then I write it. And actually, I use dictation now to do it. My newest Mr. Whisper was 80% dictation.
Mm.
Dictation. The next
Wow.
book coming out is going to be 100% or 97%, whatever.
Mm.
And then I turn it into my editor.
That's awesome.
Amazing.
Yeah, maybe not for them.
Yeah.
For
Everybody's
a
got their
reader,
role.
yeah, for a reader, it's awesome.
Yeah.
Loved Mr. Whisper. There's
Love,
so many
yeah.
things.
Love your books. Okay, I have a bonus question that's just for me. I have a 5 year
Oh,
old and a 9 year old. Do you ever teach critical thinking to these ages?
Yeah. I mean, the way the one of the ways you can teach that to them is you teach them a magic trick,
Hmm.
right? You
Hmm.
show them
okay.
a simple magic trick first, right? And
Right.
then you don't teach it to them yet. You show them the trick, and then you ask
Hmm.
them, how was this done?
Hmm.
Why do you think it was done this way, right? And you're going to get 5-year-old, 9-year-old is going to give you very different answers, but you ask them to think about why they thought it was done that way, whatever,
Hmm.
okay?
Hmm.
Hmm.
And if you can, you get them to write it down. I want you to write it down. Say, da, 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 I thought it was this way, da, 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 okay. Then you show them the trick because what'll happen is every kid will go, oh, that's stupid. I knew that.
Hmm.
But then you say, you wrote this down. You didn't. Your past self didn't know. You didn't
Oh,
understand this, okay?
yeah.
I have it
Yeah.
in writing. You did not know. And then that makes them think about, oh, wait, I didn't have that information. Then you
Yeah.
teach them the trick. Then you'd have them show it to other people and observe them and see what
Hmm.
it's like to fool an adult or fool another person, because that
Hmm.
becomes a really good lesson. But you have to get them to make some mark, some proof, because otherwise we will
Yeah.
Right?
retcon our entire history. Like, no, I knew, I kind of thought
Yeah.
Yeah,
this.
yeah, yeah.
So I go
Right.
into
Right.
classrooms,
Yeah.
I do that. I'll do high school classrooms. I'll go do a magic trick. I'll ask them for all the theories and stuff, and then I explain it, and they'll go, "Ha!" And then I point out all the different things they forgot, and that becomes a very
Yeah.
helpful reminder of
Hmm.
like you kind of have to learn how you're fooled. The people
Hmm.
like, I want to know how other people are fooled. Find out how you're fooled because you're the
Yeah.
same as other people.
Ah,
Yeah.
so
I
good.
love that because the
Yeah.
ego, will protect itself, right?
Right.
Hmm
Right.
Dare not be shamed.
And I think that when you are okay with being fooled, you unlock a new kind of wonder.
Hmm.
One
Yeah.
of my friends, Chris Kinner, is the executive producer for David Copperfield's show, and Chris Kinner is one of the finest magicians on the planet. And we're both members of the Magic Castle. It's a magic club in LA. I was just there last week and then went and saw the Harry Potter play. And
Hmm.
I love to go there because every now and then you'll get a magician in there who's come out from nowhere or Spain or somewhere who's been thinking really, really hard about how to fool magicians, which is
Hmm.
not the most useful skill outside of the Magic Castle. It's still pretty cool. And I've been there sometimes with Chris where we've sat there and Chris sees everything in the world. We've had somebody just fry us, just like make a card vanish right in front of us. His hands are completely clean. And and the magician will be like, "Do you guys want to see?" And we're like, "No, no, don't tell us this because we
Yeah.
love that. We don't get that sense of wonder enough, and it's really, really,
Yeah.
it's a great thing to feel that." I had a friend that
Yeah.
did a trick for Steve Jobs,
Hmm.
and it was the same thing. He showed Steve Jobs something, goes, "Do you want to see how this works?" And Steve Jobs said, "No, no, I don't want to know." And like, because Steve Jobs, this
Yeah.
guy, wanted that wonder, and I appreciate that. And so I think that if you teach somebody to say, "Hey, listen, saying I don't know," and all this unlocks this level
Yeah.
of, "Oh wow."
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah. And
Right.
a reminder that mystery matters,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm
Hmm.
Mystery matters. Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
Oh, Andrew, thank you so much for your time. We've loved
Yes.
this conversation. Sounds like we need to talk to your dad next, maybe.
Oh, he's more interesting. Trust me.
Well, when is his
Mm,
memoir done? We need to talk to him
Yeah.
when it's done.
absolutely. But thank you so much. This was a
Thank
treat.
Yes.
you.
Thanks for your
Thank
time.
you.